This is episode 380 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Susan Abernathy, historian at thefreelancehistorywriter.com. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
For centuries, popular narratives have painted William Shakespeare as a man who left his wife Anne Hathaway behind in Stratford-upon-Avon while he built his legacy in London. But what if that long-standing image is incomplete? A recently analyzed 17th century letter fragment addressed to, quote, good Mrs. Shakespeare suggests that Anne Hathaway may have been living in London alongside her husband. The letter references domestic and financial dealings that place Anne not on the fringes of Shakespeare's life, but potentially at the center of it, managing affairs and moving in his London social circles. To walk us through the evidence and implications of this letter is Professor Matthew Steggle, whose archival research is reshaping how we understand the Shakespeare marriage. Matthew Steggle is a distinguished scholar of early modern English literature at the University of Bristol. With a keen interest in archival discoveries, his work often sheds new light on the lives and relationships of historical figures. His recent analysis of a long-overlooked letter fragment offers a fresh perspective on the domestic life of William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, suggesting they may have shared a home in London during the early 1600s. Before we delve into today's conversation, I want to remind you that there's bonus materials available for this episode on Patreon. We've compiled images of the letter fragment, maps of early 17th century London highlighting Trinity Lane, and other resources that provide context to this remarkable discovery. To explore these extras while you listen to the show, log in at the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 380. That's CassidyCash.com/EP380. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Matthew. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with the letter itself. Can you walk us through what this fragment is, how it was discovered, and what exactly caught your attention about it?
Okay, so what we've got are two fragments, two sections of what was clearly a larger letter. They're preserved, they were discovered in 1978. By a scholar who was cataloguing a book which had previously been in a school's library. So it had been in the school library, I think, for centuries, not getting much attention. And they gave the collection to Hereford Cathedral, the local cathedral library. And the scholar was going through cataloguing it when he noticed, stuck at the spine of the book, two fragments from a letter. So these fragments are binding waste. If you were a 17th century bookbinder, you'd take the text block, the set of pages that had come from the printing press, you'd make it a cover of just the right size out of pasteboard and leather, and you'd stitch the one into the other, but you'd probably use a couple of bits of paper just as buffers between the two so that the text block didn't rub against the spine. And for that purpose, you wouldn't use new paper. Some leftover paper, you'd recycle some paper, in effect. And that's what we've got here. We've got a couple of bits of paper that were, in effect, being thrown out. They were being recycled. And so they've been accidentally preserved inside this book.
You've said this letter might reframe what we think about Anne Hathaway's role in Shakespeare's life. What exactly does the fragment say, and why is it so compelling?
Well, the fragment is a letter from someone, it's not entirely clear who, addressed to good Mrs. Shakespeare, and complaining that her husband owes money. Her husband appears to have acted as a trustee for a boy named John Butts, who's lost his father. So he's looking after the money that John Butts' father left him until John comes of age. And in particular, John seems to be on the point of finishing an apprenticeship. And this letter is complaining that they've tried to get Mr. Shakespeare to give the money to John that he's due now he's nearly finished his apprenticeship. Mr. Shakespeare won't pay up, so they're trying Mrs. Shakespeare and they're appealing to her conscience. They're saying, your conscience should tell you that you ought to pay this money to this little orphan boy. So that's what the first fragment says. Then there's a bit from further down the page where it looks like this letter writer, whoever it is somehow making excuses for their own conduct, somehow involve themselves in the affair, because they talk about having entered into a bond to pay off some sort of overplus already. The detail that really catches your attention is that they say that we entered into this bond while you dwelt at Trinity Lane. So while Mrs. Shakespeare, and by implication Mr. Shakespeare, are dwelling in a street called Trinity Lane somewhere. So it's a slice of life of the sort that you don't normally get in more formal literary documents or more formal legal things. This is a kind of clearly a much less formal arrangement that has somehow gone sour. And in particular, if it were to be the case that Mr. and Mrs. Shakespeare are William and Anne, then it seems to paint a picture of them living together, as it may be in London, which is a real surprise. So it seems to show an Anne Shakespeare, if it is Anne, who's involved in her husband's social networks, in his financial affairs, and who's actually living with him.
Most people imagine Anne staying behind in Stratford-upon-Avon. I know that's the narrative that I've heard most often, is that she was there handling the house and the kids while he was off in London to, do theater or make his career there. Does this letter provide evidence that maybe challenges that story?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you showed this to an 18th century Shakespeare scholar, he'd have said, and it would have been he would have said, I, for one, know very little about the details of Shakespeare's life, but I wouldn't be surprised to find Shakespeare's wife living with him, because that's what country gentlemen and gentlewomen did. Yeah, they would spend their time between their kind of country base and their city base. They'd come up for term time. They might go back. But about 200 years ago, a different narrative took root. This idea that Shakespeare had a really unhappy marriage, that he left Stratford largely to get away from his wife, that it was maybe a shotgun wedding, she was pregnant, and that we have a Shakespeare who's living in London without her and free to have romantic affairs and all those other things that you see, for instance, in the film Shakespeare in Love. So it's that image of a Shakespeare who's someone who writes all this amazing, passionate poetry is surely more interesting than just a wife guy. Seems to be the logic that got this story going. It's remained really dominant up to this day. In the last few years, people have started challenging it. Germaine Greer wrote a book saying, well, maybe we shouldn't assume that she's this complete illiterate person. Catherine Shiles doing some very interesting work on Anne Hathaway at the moment. But the thing that's been lacking for that work so far has been any bit of paper that shows her actually in London. So the surprise of this piece of paper is that it seems to show that she is indeed, at least some of the time, in London with her husband, rather than back in Stratford all the time, as the other model suggests.
The address of good Mrs. Shakespeare, that detail alone feels intimate and domestic. Is there significance in how Anne is addressed in this letter?
It's a rather nice thing, actually, as you can see, because early modern quills, what happens is the line starts quite dark and gradually gets paler till you refill the quill and then it gets dark again. You can see from that actually the good isn't an afterthought. They originally started it, Mrs. Shakespeare. And then they clearly looked at it and thought, no, that's a little bit rude. They put good on the front, but the ink doesn't quite match. So it is. It's a formal. It's an address that you would address a social superior in. So it says something about this Mrs. Shakespeare's social class that she's being addressed in that way. And certainly the letter writer seems to know her and seems to think that they know some of the same people and seems to think they can appeal to her in that quite personal way. So it does. The form of address is, as you say, quite intimate, really. Yeah.
What kinds of historical detective work go into confirming a letter like this? How do you verify a connection to Anne and William Shakespeare?
That's been the difficult bit. The guy who saw it in 1978 suspected that something was up. I mean, he actually also couldn't see the whole letter. It was still bound in the book at that stage. And even when the whole letter was disbound about 10 years ago, it still didn't seem like there were many clues that could make you confident that it was William and Anne Shakespeare rather than any of the other Shakespeares of the period. So the ingredients are, firstly, you work out a rough date for it. A handwriting expert I've consulted says that it looks to him like the handwriting of sort of 1590 to 1620, And that figures with the book. It's bound in a book that's printed in 1608. And waste in books is sometimes from about the same date as the book's printed. That's not an invariable rule. It's more of a sort of rule of thumb. But again, that would speak to that. And certainly the binding looks quite early, although it's very difficult to be categorical. But if you go with that date, 1590 to 1620, then the next question is, where in the country has a place called Trinity Lane at that kind of date? And you can go and look at bits of paper and kind of archive catalogues. And I came up with a list of probably 8 or 9 places called Trinity Lane up and down the country that are referred to in early modern documents. And it soon became apparent that actually the vast majority of them referred to one Trinity Lane in particular, the one in London. It's where the money is, it's where the interest is. It's the one that tends to show up in documents. Moreover, of all the ones on the list, the London one is the only one that has recorded Shakespeare's living in that settlement at that time, and the book's printed in London, and apprenticeships are more associated with London and other things. So there's a whole bunch of evidence that sort of makes you think that the Trinity Lane in this letter is in London. And actually, once you've got a date range like that and a London location, then you can look at the other people called Shakespeare in the city of London at that time. For more than 100 years, scholars have been really interested in anyone with that magic surname in the city. So we've got quite good descriptions of the various other married couples called Shakespeare at the time, and they're all one parish people. They get married in a parish. They have a load of children in that parish. They're pinned to that parish by various other sorts of records, and then they die in that parish. So that you've got a Shakespeare living at this address where no Shakespeare is known to live. It can't really be any of the others because they're marooned in other places. William Shakespeare, who visibly does move around London in the course of his career, is really the only recorded Shakespeare that fits the bill. And actually, you'd probably expect someone respectable, like a trustee, who's clearly been in London for some years from the content of the letter. You'd expect someone like that probably to turn up in a document of some sort. And so the Shakespeares, William and Anne Shakespeare, are the only ones who fit the bill.
What else do we know about the area of Trinity Lane in the early 1600s? Was it common for playwrights or actors to live in this area?
It was quite posh, actually. It was quite upmarket. I don't know if you or your listeners have been to the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre on the South Bank. Yeah, if you come out of there and go to get a boat from the boat stop, you're looking across the river at a sort of dink in the bank called Queenhithe, where there's a sort of beach of mud and stones, which was a sort of major transport hub in Shakespeare's London. And Trinity Lane ran into the back of Queenhithe. So it's a very central location. It's a very well-connected location. Some quite wealthy people lived there as well. So it's quite an upmarket. It's one of those kind of quiet and sophisticated bits of the city. So it's quite a nice place to be living. All Shakespeare's colleagues tended to live in the famous bits where the players live are up north around Shoreditch, where the theatres are, which has a reputation as a bit more of the Wild West. This is definitely a rather more upmarket address being described. One of the exciting things about this letter is that it's so geographically specifically. You can actually go and walk along the line of Trinity Lane now, and you can research the area in such detail. It's just like a very vivid coordinate.
Of all the reactions you've received since sharing this research, has any one response stuck with you or surprised you?
I've had a number of letters from authorship deniers explaining that it demonstrates that Shakespeare didn't write the plays attributed to him. I was a little surprised by them, but I think it doesn't really matter what's in the article. I think they'd think that anyway. I had a lovely email from a guy who'd worked for a debt collection agency. He said, this is an absolutely classic debt collector strategy to go after the missus. So I thought that was a nice detail, actually. That kind of made it seem real.
A little bit of some confirmation that this could have happened this way. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I know that we would love to look into some of these details further that you've shared with us here. Where should we start? If we want to explore this subject further, where should we begin?
The whole of the article that I've been talking around is available online for free. There's no subscription or anything required, thanks to the generosity of my university, who've made it available completely open access with the Shakespeare Journal. So there's a web link for that, so you can read the whole thing. Be warned, it is quite long. And there are a couple of other places you can go. I mean, if you're interested in Anne Hathaway as a figure, and actually even calling her Anne Hathaway is a slightly, you might think is a slightly loaded thing. Why do we call Shakespeare's wife not Anne Shakespeare, as would be normal? Why do we insist on using her maiden name all the time? And it's because people have always wanted to put a bit of distance between the Shakespeares, between man and wife on that score. But if you want to read more about her, about Anne, there's a really good book by Catherine Scheil on the various fictional versions of Anne that have been imagined over the years. And another thing I'd really recommend is a great book by Charles Nicholl called The Lodger. If you're interested in Shakespeare and the kind of the streets that Shakespeare's on and the minutiae of Shakespeare's life, Charles Nicholl does this amazing job with the lawsuit that Shakespeare's involved in a little later in his career, where he's ended up accidentally being involved in another verbal promise that's gone wrong. He's been a witness to the engagement of his landlord's daughter to the family apprentice, and people are accusing each other of breaking verbal promises and things. And it's not completely dissimilar in tone to the incident that we see in this letter. But anyway, Charles Nicholl uses that as the jumping off point for a totally wonderful book, a totally wonderful exploration of Shakespeare in Jacobean London. And I can't recommend that highly enough. That's an absolute page-turner of a book. So there might be some starting points, yeah.
Catherine Scheil has been on our show previously to talk about Anne Hathaway and some of the details that she covers in her book. So we'll link to that episode as well as to her book and the entire article of Matthew's research into this letter fragment. Thank you to the University of Bristol and the Shakespeare Journal for making it possible for us to read that without a fee. That is just fantastic. And all of these resources will be listed in the show notes for this episode. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Matthew, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
This is a very difficult question. This is
the
a great
hardest one,
question.
isn't it? Yes.
It's a lovely question, and I've thought for ages about what I would take. Would I take one of the poets that I love, someone like Yeats or Auden or Louis MacNeice? Would I take Paradise Lost or something? But I think what I might end up taking is actually the complete works of Ben Jonson, which conveniently we have there. If that would be all right. It's rather a large book. It's more of a sort of set of books.
It's fine, yes.
Okay, well, that's encouraging, because Jonson talked about Virgil's poetry as being rammed with life. And that's kind of how I feel about Jonson, really, that there's just so much joie de vivre, so much life in it. And obviously, on a desert island, there would be plenty of opportunity to read Jonson against his friend and rival Shakespeare, read Jonson against the Bible, compose lectures to the seagulls. I think that's probably what I'd be doing on the desert island. It'd be great.
Well, and I'm sure they would be wrapped with attention. Absolutely. Having the joy of life seems like a definite essential on your deserted island, so I think that works very well. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
There's a Shakespeare biography in the works, which is the thing that's got me into this mess with this document. It was actually following up on a footnote. I was thinking, that's a funny thing. That's the thing a biographer ought to know about. And that's kind of what's led me down this particular rabbit hole. I'm working on an edition of the poet and playwright John Marston, which has been going for some years. That's hopefully going to be coming out soon. That should be really good. I think that'll have a major effect on how people see him. I do have one other crazy piece of Shakespeare-related paper up my sleeve, but I'm not going to talk about that yet because it might turn out to be nothing. But
okay. Well, exciting things coming from Matthew Steggle. We'll look forward to seeing what comes of all of these projects. Thank you so much, Matthew, for sharing this research with us today. It's really an honor to get to speak with you, and it was exciting to explore this history and learn something new about the life of Anne and William Shakespeare. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Cassidy. It was an absolute pleasure.
That wraps up our deep dive into the archives, overlooked fragments, and the quiet details that just might change what we thought we knew about Anne Hathaway and her life with William Shakespeare. A special thank you to Matthew Steggle for taking the time to share with us this exciting new tidbit from Shakespeare's life. Just a reminder, you can explore more in the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 380. There you'll find out more about Matthew, links to the resources he's mentioned today, and a collection of related podcast episodes that let you dive even deeper into the life of Anne Hathaway Shakespeare. And if you're a patron or you want to become one, there's bonus content waiting for you on that website as well. You can log in or join us there to view images of the letter fragment, maps of Bishopsgate, and further history on Anne Hathaway Shakespeare and Stratford-upon-Avon. Just look for the Patreon buttons to get started. And if you're ready to go one step further into the life of William Shakespeare and really try out a piece of the 17th century, then you can join Experience Shakespeare, our immersive tier on Patreon, where you can access hands-on activity kits that bring history to life. So you can not only learn about Shakespeare's world, but actually try out a piece of it for yourself. On Patreon, click Experience Shakespeare to find out more. Again, all of these extras are available at CassidyCash.com/episode 380. That's CassidyCash.com/EP380. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your assumptions be questioned, your archives yield surprises, and your love of learning carry you to unexpected places. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.